All right. Hey guys. You have hopefully recently watched some of Tara's videos, which are an introduction to RStudio and getting familiar with the RStudio space that I have shared on my screen. And so assuming that's true, we're going to talk a little bit more in the abstract about getting started in R from the perspective of project management. So if you are starting your master's, your PhD in your first or second year, there's still a really long road ahead. And one of the reasons that we started with this whole GitHub setup and we want you to have this thing called a repository is that we really want to instill some good project management practices. That means, how do you organize yourself in a way that will actually set you up for success when it comes to organizing a ton of data, a ton of code, some of which works, some of which doesn't, that sort of adds up and collects over the years. And one way of doing this is just starting with a file structure that is consistent and makes sense across the way that you organize your projects in R. So if we've all synced up correctly, as I think we all have now, you should see that you are opened up inside RStudio in your class project. And because of that, we should all have a really similar looking file structure here. And so one of the things that we set up for you all in this repository template was a data folder, because inside this data folder lives the data that we're going to be using for this class. But it also gives you a model of a baseline structure of setting up a project, and we're going to add to it a little bit right now just to get you into the groove of that. Which is that when you're thinking about setting up a project, most projects have at least two main folders in addition to this RProject item that we'll talk about in a minute, and a README file. So we've had you already edit your README file as part of kind of the getting set up instructions. And typically this README file acts like a plain text file where you can write out documentation for your project. So we used it a little bit untraditionally because we asked you to just write things like your name and your pronouns. But if you were, say, working on a particular paper or certain project for a given season, you might document what is happening inside these folders in that README file. But also typically you'll have a data file, and you'll also usually have a code or a scripts folder where you keep all of the scripts that you write. So I would encourage you to follow along with me and create this folder for your scripts, so that when you're working in class, you can have your class notes, you can have your assignments all set up in there. And so you might be gravitating towards kind of this button in RStudio, because you can create a new folder just by clicking. And that's totally fine. I do it all the time. You would just click and name it and it would pop it in there. But I want to also show you how to create a folder from the console and through code, because this is partly what we're learning, right? How to do things in R, not using our mouse, essentially. And in the other videos, Tara kind of briefly introduced this idea of functions, which will really be the heart of what we do in this class. Is we use functions to accomplish goals that we want to accomplish in R. But it takes a little bit while to get used to those functions. We don't memorize them all. Oftentimes we're Googling them, but many of the functions that we use in this class have been committed to memory by many of the instructors. So I know that the function to create a new folder in R is equivalent to sort of creating a directory. So it starts dir, and like Tara showed you, you sort of have this, R will prompt you with a lot of options for functions. So I'm doing dir.create. So that is the directory creation function. I'll then open up parentheses where I can put in arguments to that function. And you'll see it prompts that's given some of the names of the arguments. So path, show warnings, recursive, etc. We don't need to know all of that right now, but we're just going to give it the path argument. And this comes back to something that I've highlighted for a few of you while we talk through getting Git set up, is that file paths are really mega key to having good project management in GitHub. And so we want to specify the path. Now, in this case, we can just say path equals, and we're just going to give our folder a name. So we actually don't need to give it a path, and I'll tell you why in a second. And we just want this folder to be named scripts. We're going to put it in quotation marks because it's a new named item that we want R to assign that name to. And then we can run this line of code. Because we're just in the console, we can press enter. And what we see is that scripts has now populated as a folder inside my directory in this bottom corner. But the big question is, how did R know where to put that scripts file? Because I actually only wrote path equals scripts. And the magic of how R knew where to put that really has to do with this whole project setup and what we've been trying to achieve on GitHub, which has to do with setting your working directory to a particular project. And your working directory is essentially the directory where R thinks you are from the start of a project. And you can often ask R, what is my working directory, with another function, get WD, which stands for get working directory. And this function actually doesn't need any arguments. You just need to leave an open and a closed parentheses. And if you run that line, what R tells you, what the console spits out, is the full file path that your project lives in. And if you put your project on your desktop in a folder like we asked, then your file path should look really similar. And it starts at the very beginning of your computer. It starts users, your name, my desktop, my RDavis folder, and then my project folder. And this, I feel like the importance of this really can't be overstated, because it makes your life a lot easier to know exactly where to put things, and it helps R know where to save things. So that if we start wanting to read something in from another source, for instance, we know how to move around in our file paths in R to find it. So for instance, I can even just open up quotation marks, and without any functions around it, R kind of expects to be looking through a file path if you just open quotation marks with no function. And so I can open quotation marks and hit tab, like the tab button on my keyboard, because tab is a really powerful thing that RStudio, can help try to auto-complete your thought with. And what it offers me up are everything in my immediate vicinity. So it knows it starts in my R class project, because that is the default working directory relative to where this .rproj file is. And then it tells me what's next in that path. So I can either go into data, or I can go into scripts, or I can open the README. And so I can go into data, for instance, and I can say, okay, how about I want to go down this path towards data? I type in the words data, and then I might potentially want to see what's inside data. And just like you would click on the folder and open it to see, we can use forward slashes as sort of delineators, as if we're clicking on that file so that we can look inside. And we can see that there are 3 files within the data folder that we'll be using in class. And we'd be able to tell the same thing again if we clicked. So this is really just about starting to get us in the mindset of understanding this idea of a file path, right? It's the sequence of files as if you were clicking through them on your computer. And that R, by default, if you've set up your project correctly, thinks that that sets your working directory right next to this R project so that you can navigate from there. And so as we start to do things like read in data, or maybe if you happen to save something in your desktop, you can understand how to navigate through your file path to grab a thing where it might be saved, or to save something in or outside of your project. And that's all I'm going to leave you with for now. We're just going to stew on file paths, and we'll talk more about this in class.